Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. Today I have my Rose Care in December video, which is a part of my Roses Month by Month series, where I talk about the care and considerations for growing your roses well throughout the year. So what's to do in December? And as you might note behind me, things are looking a little bit dead, a little bit of color over here, but mostly things are going dormant, and it isn't as heavy a month for rose care. If you were in India or California, it might be a far busier month for roses, but here it's a little bit calmer. Now, for the sake of consistency, I still will go through all of the topics one by one, just to make sure we're covering the bases. First one of which is activities, and I want to remind you at the top end of that list as a review that some things should already be completed. We're expecting a switch towards colder weather here, so safeguarding your roses in the landscape and in containers is top of the list. Something we've already done, I talked about in the October and November video, was pruning down the tall branches that you are afraid might be broken in wind or snow load through the winter. Those ones should be pruned down to a more manageable height. Second thing is to prepare your containers. Some of my containers, I had so many of them, I actually moved them in preemptively and cleaned off their foliage. I'll show you the group in the greenhouse, and other ones are still waiting outside, waiting for the weather to change or the cold to come, and once it's in the forecast, I'll tuck them into the garage and do a cleanup at that point. All of that being said, the main activities in this month are more to do with planning than planting, so let's talk about those. Here's a reminder to get some wood chips ordered and on the way and delivered in preparation for your spring pruning. I usually do it in February, but I'm not always assured to get chip delivery because I use a free service. I don't always get that timely, so it's nice to arrange it now when there's lots of winter breakage of trees and so on. The landscapers are chipping stuff, they'll drop this off for free. I do that through a service called Chip Drop, which just connects gardeners with landscapers. So maybe look into that service and make that request now, because you're never sure how much you're going to get and when you'll get it once you make that request. And it's nice to have it on hand and ready for when you start your pruning activities in the spring. In climates with a cold winter, it might not be the right time to put your shovel in the ground, but it doesn't mean it's a bad time to shop for roses. And in fact, this is traditionally a time of year where you'll see lots of rose sellers beginning to list their products or prepare to list them. I think Palatine Roses just listed their roses for pre-sale within the last couple of days, and all of the different websites, because they have their inventories in hand, they've counted things, are starting to prepare to do so. I think High Country Roses also lists their stuff in January. We'll be listing ours in February, so this is the good time to start looking around, making your wish list of roses. Sites like Help Me Find, where you can look up the attributes of roses, or just generally read books and get to daydreaming about your rose garden for next year, so that you go in prepared and knowing which roses you actually want and will thrive in your climate. When it comes to soil and fertilizer, I just want to remind you and reiterate that this is not the right time of year to be feeding your roses with anything to encourage new growth. They can't absorb it, and you may do more harm than good. But the one exception to that is, I mentioned that last month, that if you can get your soil testing service for cheap or free in your area, it's a good time to get that done. And if it indicates a deficiency or a change that needs to happen over a longer period, it's not a bad idea to start working on that right now. pH changes, if you've indicated a very high or very low pH and you'd like to bring it back towards the neutral or slightly acidic that roses prefer, those changes can take an awfully long time to show up in the soil. So making those changes now, either with sulfur to lower the pH or with lime, for instance, to raise the pH, that's not a bad idea. Now, I do have a couple of quick insights to share about watering in the month of December. The first one is drip irrigation. I'm showing you this bed here where I installed drip irrigation this year, and it has saved me a ton of time and water, because when you do overhead watering, not only does it spur on foliar disease in roses, but it also, you lose so much to evaporation or just inappropriate landing of the water, not at the root zone of the roses. Drip irrigation gets it directly where it needed. Now, the question is December the right time to address that? Not necessarily to install, but it's a great time to do your research, size the garden, order the supplies. I'll put in some links to DripWorks down below. That's where I got this one here. It's been super reliable. My next point in this section is going to be what I call the contradiction of winter watering for roses and other plants in pots. Not just roses, because this applies to many other plants that you're overwintering in pots. People ask me how much water do they need, and the point is not that much. It's cool and the plants aren't going through it. So I say manage them on the dry side, and this holds to be true up until about the point when you're expecting deep cold, at which point they actually need to have a decent amount of water in those pots to insulate them or to not dry out, to desiccate during those cold patches. So I watch the weather, I watch the forecast to see when we're expecting deep cold, and by deep cold I mean well below freezing, and if that's coming on, I go out here and I water these, I take care of any mounding over or hilling over of any roses that I'm concerned about in the landscape. I move things in as needed, and so that's part of the routine of preparing for severe cold weather, is making sure you get some water into those pots. In the section on plant propagation, let's discuss that December and January are really peak time to do hardwood cuttings. I'll insert some footage of that method here. It's really not that hard. You're just cutting off sections of stem and sticking them in the ground, maybe with rooting hormone, that's optional. But I did want to mention for this highlight of the method here that it does matter which stems you choose. So you are looking for stems like this that are the firmed up stems from this year's growth. You can see this has fresh leaves on it, but also it's fresh growth, but I can feel that it's fully hardened off. It should be at this time of year. What you're not targeting are older, thicker stems like this one here. These are the last year's growth. They're well established and they're less likely to root by this method for you. So you are looking for fresh this year's stems. On the section of pests, let's talk about botrytis. Now, botrytis is gray mold. You'll see it on strawberries when they go rotten in the fridge. It's kind of likes the cold temperatures, just like you'd find cool and moist in a greenhouse or on your plants. When there's lots of extra leaves still hanging out upon them, they look for that organic matter and they start to rot it down. That's its job in nature. So the point is, it's the same as any other time of year, is to be watchful on your plants. Get your eyes on them. And you see on here that there is a lot. This is a plant called Geum, and it stays in active growth over the winter, and there is a lot of dead leaves on there, and the botrytis is moving in. If I leave it to its own, what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and rot the crown. This is the same reason why on roses you want to strip the foliage off before it's going to spend any time, any serious amount of time, either under cover by crop cover or inside the garage or inside a greenhouse overwintering. You want to get that foliage off so it's nice and clean and you don't end up with botrytis. Well, this is the section of the video that I usually set aside to spotlight a particular rose for its flowers or ornamental qualities in the garden. And of course, some of them are still hanging around out there. This one here is Radio Times, has quite a pretty decent bloom on it. But I did want to spotlight, rather than a particular rose, a feature of roses, which is their rose hips. So hanging out with things like the beautyberry bush that come out this time of year, or of course, the ornamental qualities of holly, roses are not far left behind. They actually fit in quite nicely. Of course, the big hips of Rosa rugosa here, the very tiny sprays of the rose I have in my collection as Robin Hood really shows off. And the one that really impressed me when I walked around today, this one here is Fred Loads, a new rose to me this year. Really, really loud blooms, but look at those hips on there. What a great way to finish out the season with a new rose. All right, that's it from me. I just thank you for watching the video, and if I don't catch up with you before then, or you don't catch up with me on the channel, have a happy holiday season, and we'll definitely catch up together in January and February where things start to pick up a little bit in the rose garden.